Trump extended the ceasefire. Hours later Iran seized 2 container ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Then a third vessel came under fire. Brent crude jumped back above $100 a barrel. The ceasefire that was supposedly holding was producing the most violent day in the strait since the war began, according to one commodity analyst who has been tracking every movement through that waterway. And 30 nations were simultaneously meeting in a military conference room in North London planning how to force the strait open by force once conditions permit. That phrase is the key to everything happening right now. Once conditions permit. Because right now conditions do not permit anything. And what is being hidden inside the ceasefire reports is the real answer to why. There is a fundamental gap between what the word ceasefire communicates to a global audience and what is actually happening across the Gulf region right now. That gap is not accidental. It is the product of every actor in this conflict having a powerful incentive to present their actions as defensive and their adversaries' actions as violations while the underlying conflict continues evolving. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to what Trump called a double-sided ceasefire. The terms were that the US and Israel would suspend strikes against Iran and Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Within hours Netanyahu declared the ceasefire did not include Lebanon and launched the largest Israeli strike package of the entire war against Hezbollah in what was called Operation Eternal Darkness. Iran responded by closing the strait again, citing Israeli attacks in Lebanon as a violation. The ceasefire that had been announced to global relief was effectively over before most of the world had finished reading the headlines. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a negotiating structure in which every party publicly claimed to be honoring the ceasefire while each simultaneously took actions that any neutral observer would describe as resuming the conflict. The US maintained a naval blockade of Iranian ports, which Iran called an act of war and a ceasefire violation. Iran operated its IRGC toll booth system in the strait, charging over $1 million per vessel for passage, which the US called a violation of the ceasefire terms. The US Navy seized an Iranian cargo ship named Tuzka in the Gulf of Oman after firing into its engine room. Iran called that a truce violation. Israel continued striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Hezbollah fired rockets back at Israeli positions. Iraqi Kurdistan was hit by 16 missile and drone attacks after the ceasefire was declared. On April 22, Iran fired on 3 commercial vessels in the strait. It seized 2 container ships. The Panama-flagged MSC Francesca and the Liberia-flagged Epaminondas were escorted to Iranian shores by IRGC naval vessels. These were the first ship seizures by Iran since the war began. And they happened hours after Trump had just extended the ceasefire. That is what the ceasefire reports are hiding. Not a pause in conflict. A continuation of conflict operating under the diplomatic branding of a ceasefire. The reason the ceasefire cannot simply collapse is not military or diplomatic. It is economic. And understanding the economic trap that every actor in this conflict is caught in explains why the reports keep describing a ceasefire that does not function as one. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed to normal commercial traffic since March 2, 2026. The International Energy Agency described the resulting supply disruption as the biggest energy crisis in history. The numbers behind that description are concrete and severe. Roughly 20% of global oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas normally passes through the strait. Before the war, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day transited that 34-kilometer choke point. Since the closure, commodity analyst Rory Johnston estimated supply disruptions of approximately 13 million barrels of crude condensates and natural gas liquids per day. The cumulative effect had already exceeded 500 million barrels of lost supply by late April. Even if a deal were reached tomorrow, Johnston warned it could take months to claw back the supply lost during weeks of closure, keeping oil prices elevated long after any agreement. The global economic consequences are already cascading in specific and measurable ways. In California, gasoline prices exceeded $5 per gallon by mid-March. On March 19, Dubai crude oil prices reached $166 per barrel, their highest on record. European gas storage, which entered the conflict at historically low levels of around 30% capacity, saw Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly double to over €60 per megawatt-hour. The IMF warned on April 22 that global growth will inevitably take a hit even if the ceasefire holds, citing uncertainty over the strait as a persistent drag pushing up energy costs and inflation. The 2026 Iran war fuel crisis Wikipedia page now exists as a standalone article documenting what has become a worldwide fuel shortage. The trap works in both directions simultaneously. The US needs the strait open because every day it remains closed increases energy prices for American consumers and creates domestic political pressure on an administration that has claimed military victory. Trump posted on Truth Social that Iran is collapsing financially, losing $500 million a day, and that Iranian military and police were not being paid. But every day the blockade continues, those same energy prices remain elevated for American families too. The weapon is double-edged. Iran is caught in a mirror image trap. With oil and gas representing 80% of government export revenues, the closure of Karg Island, which handles 92% of Iranian crude exports, effectively zeroed out $139 million in daily revenue according to Arab News analysis. The blockade was pushing Iran's already fragile economy toward what analysts described as terminal hyperinflation. The rial had cratered to 1.3 million per dollar and food inflation had hit 105% as of February 2026. Iran's oil wells face a specific technical danger from the storage crisis. Once onshore storage fills completely, Iran would need to shut in older oil fields, and the damage from that process is partially permanent. Arab News estimated that shutting in those fields could permanently eliminate up to 500,000 barrels per day of future production capacity, representing roughly $15 billion in lost annual revenue that can never be recovered. Both sides are bleeding from the same wound. Neither can afford to let the strait stay closed indefinitely. Neither wants to be the side that capitulates publicly. That is the economic trap the ceasefire reports are hiding inside their daily violation counts. On April 22, 2026, military planners from more than 30 nations gathered at the UK's permanent joint headquarters in Northwood, North London. The conference was co-hosted by Britain and France and described in official statements as an effort to translate diplomatic consensus into a joint military plan to safeguard freedom of navigation in the strait. Read that sentence carefully. Military planners. Joint military plan. 30 nations. For a strait where a ceasefire is supposedly in effect. This conference is not a diplomatic initiative. It is operational planning for a potential military operation to force the Strait of Hormuz open by an international coalition if the current ceasefire and negotiating process fails to produce a workable agreement. The UK government statement confirmed the sessions would advance military plans to reopen the strait as soon as conditions permit following a sustainable ceasefire agreement. The specific capabilities being discussed at Northwood include protecting merchant vessels from IRGC attacks, reassuring commercial shipping operators, and conducting mine clearance operations. That last element is critical. One of the most underreported facts in the entire ceasefire period is that Iran reportedly lost track of mines it planted in the Strait of Hormuz during the war and is therefore unable to fully open the strait even if it wanted to. The U.S. Navy began mine clearance operations on April 11, sending destroyers into the strait for the first time since the war began. Iran threatened to attack those ships, calling the mine clearance an act of aggression. The mines are still there. Nobody knows exactly where all of them are. Ships attempting to transit do so at genuine physical risk beyond just the threat of IRGC gunboats. The Northwood Conference is building on a Paris summit attended by 51 countries on April 17, where European leaders called for the unconditional, unrestricted and immediate reopening of the strait. What is significant about that language is what it implies about the current state of affairs. Unconditional means without Iran's toll conditions. Unrestricted means without IRGC vetting of vessels. Immediate means now, not after a final peace deal. Those demands are incompatible with Iran's current position, which is that it maintains the right to oversee and charge for passage through the strait as a permanent strategic asset. The London conference is not planning for a scenario where Iran agrees. It is planning for a scenario where Iran does not agree and the international community decides to act. The deep transatlantic rift revealed by this process is equally significant. Since the war began, the US had repeatedly called on NATO allies to join escort operations in the Strait by force. Every European nation declined. CGTN analysis described those rifts as very profound, adding that US-Europe relations can never go back to what they once were. Europe is now building its own military framework for the Strait that operates independently of Washington's timeline and conditions. Britain and France are planning a multinational force that would deploy to protect shipping without requiring an American green light. The silence from Tehran that preceded the ceasefire extension on April 21 was not a communication failure. It was a symptom of a governing structure that is genuinely fractured in ways that make unified decision-making functionally impossible. Trump described Iran's government as seriously fractured in his ceasefire extension announcement. That assessment tracks with what multiple independent sources have reported about conditions inside Iran since Khamenei's death on February 28. The New York Times reported in late March that Iran's leadership was paralyzed with severely disrupted decision-making processes and that damage to communications infrastructure had caused paranoia and internal power struggles. The new supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei was elevated on March 8, 2026. He inherited an office that his father held for more than 3 decades and built into a position of near-total authority over the IRGC, the nuclear program, the proxy network, and Iran's diplomatic posture. Mojtaba Khamenei has none of that accumulated institutional authority. He is attempting to establish his legitimacy over a political system that is simultaneously managing a devastating military defeat, an economic crisis of historic proportions, and an internal power struggle between competing factions with different views on whether to fight, negotiate, or wait. The competing signals coming from Tehran reflect this fractured reality directly. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi publicly called the blockade an act of war and said Iran knows how to neutralize restrictions, defend its interests, and resist bullying. Iran's parliament speaker advisor Mahdi Mohammadi called Trump's ceasefire extension meaningless and said the blockade must be met with a military response and called the extension a ploy to buy time for a surprise strike. Iran's negotiating team told Pakistani mediators they saw no prospect of participating in the second round of Islamabad talks. Yet Pakistani mediators confirmed Iran was still in contact and had not formally withdrawn. The foreign ministry said the uncertainty was due to contradictory messages from Washington, not indecision on Iran's part. U.S. officials told CNN that Mojtaba Khamenei has been deliberately staying hidden since taking power and that those efforts to remain concealed have disrupted internal Iranian government discussions. You cannot make a deal with a government whose supreme leader is hiding. You cannot verify Iranian commitments when the person with the authority to make those commitments irreversible is not publicly engaged in the process. The 3 ship attacks and 2 seizures on April 22 happened in this context. They were not a coordinated strategic decision by a unified Iranian government. They were the IRGC continuing to operate according to its own institutional logic in a situation where the central political authority that would normally constrain or direct that behavior is fractured and partially disengaged. The ceasefire headlines dominate the news cycle. The fuel crisis those same headlines are supposed to be ending is affecting the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people, and it is not being connected clearly enough to what the ceasefire actually is and is not accomplishing. In the UK, a poll showed 1 in 10 people were already stockpiling fuel by late April. European gas storage, which was at 30% capacity when the war began, was described by multiple analysts as on a trajectory toward an energy crisis comparable to the 2022 post-Ukraine invasion shock. The European Commission advised its member states to fill gas storage early to avoid price spikes later in the year. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks had nearly doubled from pre-war levels. The fuel crisis extended far beyond Europe. Global fertilizer production was severely disrupted because 30 to 35% of world urea exports and 20 to 30% of ammonia exports normally transit the strait. Fertilizer price spikes affect food production costs globally, with consequences that will take months to fully manifest in retail food prices. Aluminum production was affected because Gulf states account for 20% of raw aluminum exports. U.S. defense industry supply chains faced near-total disruption of critical mineral flows, particularly sulfur, through the strait. The IEA, which released 400 million barrels of emergency oil reserves in an attempt to stabilize prices, described the crisis as the biggest energy disruption in history. Even that extraordinary emergency release was not sufficient to offset the ongoing supply shock. J.P. Morgan analyst Natasha Keneva stated that even if the strait reopened immediately, oil prices would probably see an immediate drop of $10 to $20 per barrel from speculative positions, but that the underlying supply deficit from weeks of closure would take months to recover. This is what every ceasefire announcement and every ceasefire extension and every report of a ceasefire violation is actually about at its core. Not missiles and drones and naval seizures in isolation. The global economy's exposure to a 34-kilometer choke point that nobody currently controls absolutely but everybody depends on completely. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports was announced on April 13 after the Islamabad talks failed. It was framed as maximum economic pressure designed to force Iran to negotiate seriously. The logic was straightforward. Cut off Iran's oil revenue. Fill Karg Island storage. Force a shutdown of Iranian oil wells with permanent damage potential. Create a financial crisis severe enough that the Iranian government has no choice but to accept American terms. That logic contains a structural flaw that Trump's own advisors privately acknowledged to CNN. Alleviating pressure could allow Iran to drag out negotiations. But maintaining the pressure prevents the talks from happening because Iran has stated it will not negotiate while under economic siege. The blockade is simultaneously the tool that creates negotiating leverage and the obstacle that prevents negotiations from occurring. Both things are true at the same time. Trump said on CNBC on April 21 that he was not going to open the strait until there is a final deal. Iran said it would not attend talks while the blockade continues. These positions are mutually exclusive in a way that no mediator can bridge without one side publicly backing down. Pakistan's mediators are trying to find language that allows both sides to claim they did not blink first. But the structural impasse is real. The 3 to 5 day window that U.S. officials said Trump had privately given Iran to resolve internal disagreements and return to the table is itself a trap. If Iran does not produce a unified proposal within that window, Trump faces the same decision he faced on April 21. Resume strikes and accept the global economic consequences of renewed conflict. Or extend the ceasefire again and signal that the deadlines are not real. Trump said he expects to be bombing if a deal is not reached. He said he was ready to go. He also said he wants a great deal and thinks Iran has no choice. Both statements were made on the same day. The ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects a genuine tension between the military option, which carries enormous economic risks, and the diplomatic option, which requires Iranian counterparts who can actually make binding commitments. The 3 ships attacked and 2 seized in the strait on April 22, 2026 deserve more analytical attention than they received in the ceasefire violation counts that dominated the news cycle. Ship seizures are different from ship attacks. An attack with an IRGC gunboat firing on a passing container vessel is a show of force. A seizure where Iranian naval forces board a vessel, escort it to Iranian shores and hold it there is a hostage dynamic. The Panama-flagged MSC Francesca and the Liberia-flagged Epaminondas are sitting off the Iranian coast. Their crews are in Iranian custody. Their cargo is inaccessible to their owners. This creates a negotiating chip for Iran that does not disappear when a ceasefire is extended or a deadline is set. The pattern of ship seizures mirrors a tactic Iran has used repeatedly in previous crises. In 2019, Iran seized the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero. In 2021 it seized the South Korean tanker Hankook Chemi. In both cases the ships were held for months. The Stena Impero was released after 4 months following diplomatic negotiations. The Hankook Chemi was held for nearly a year. Iran used both vessels as leverage in separate disputes over frozen assets and sanctions. The ceasefire reports hide this pattern by treating each ship incident as an isolated violation rather than as part of a coherent strategy. Iran is not randomly attacking ships in the strait while simultaneously negotiating a peace deal. Iran is building leverage through ship seizures that can be traded in future negotiations. Every vessel held at an Iranian port is a bargaining chip. Every crew member aboard is a human being whose situation creates diplomatic pressure on their home government to push for faster resolution. The 230 loaded oil tankers that Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed were waiting inside the Gulf as of April 9 represent a similar structural reality. Those tankers are full of oil that producing countries need to sell. Every day they remain trapped inside the Gulf is a day those countries lose revenue. Every conversation between Saudi Aramco executives and their government officials about those stranded tankers is a conversation that creates pressure for a resolution on whatever terms make the ships move. The answer to the question in this analysis title is not one thing. It is a layered set of realities that the word ceasefire obscures. The ceasefire reports hide the fact that this is not a pause between phases of conflict. It is an active phase of conflict operating through economic pressure, ship seizures, blockade enforcement, mine clearance operations and proxy warfare in Lebanon simultaneously with diplomatic negotiations that have not yet produced a single binding commitment on either side's core demands. The ceasefire reports hide the fact that Iran's government cannot currently make binding commitments even if it wanted to because the supreme leader is hiding his location. The parliament speaker's faction and the foreign ministry are sending contradictory signals, and the IRGC is operating according to its own institutional priorities regardless of what any negotiating delegation agrees to in Islamabad. The ceasefire reports hide the fact that 30 nations are actively planning military operations to force the Strait of Hormuz open by coalition force as soon as conditions permit because they do not believe the US-Iran diplomatic track will produce a sustainable agreement in a timeframe that the global economy can afford to wait for. The ceasefire reports hide the fact that Iran planted mines in the strait during the war and cannot fully account for their locations, meaning that even if every political and economic issue were resolved tomorrow, the physical reopening of the strait to safe commercial traffic would still require a military mine clearance operation that Iran has threatened to treat as an act of aggression. The ceasefire reports hide the fact that this conflict has exposed permanent fractures in the transatlantic relationship between the US and its NATO allies that will not heal when the guns stop. Europe is building its own military framework for the strait because it has concluded it cannot rely on Washington to protect its energy security, and it does not want to be dragged into future American military decisions in the Gulf without having its own operational capacity in place. And the ceasefire reports hide the most important economic truth of the entire situation. Even if a final comprehensive agreement were signed tomorrow and the strait opened fully and immediately, the oil that was not produced and the energy that was not delivered during the weeks of closure cannot be recovered retroactively. The supply deficit is already baked into global markets. The inflation it is generating in every import-dependent economy is already in motion. The damage to Iranian oil wells that are being stressed by the storage crisis may be partially permanent. The big trap in the Gulf is not that the ceasefire might fail. The trap is that the costs of the conflict are already accumulating faster than any negotiated outcome can reverse them. And every day that passes with ship seizures and blockade enforcement and IRGC gunboats firing on container vessels while diplomats debate whether to hold a second round of talks in Islamabad is another day those costs compound in ways that cannot be undone by whatever agreement eventually emerges. That is the real story inside every ceasefire report. Not who violated the truce this morning. What the truce is costing while everyone argues about whether it exists.